God, how wonderful. Old friends right in the first row. Um, well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the festival. You know, everything you know in your life, every sense you have of being modern, every existential affliction or affirmation was born in the mud and blood of Flanders in the First World War. Darwin, Freud, Einstein were men of the 19th century, but their radical ideas that species are mutable, that you don't control the sanctity of your own thoughts, that the apple doesn't fall, as Newton said, were all kind of sown in the soil of the 20th century, soil saturated by the blood of Flanders. Joyce, Jazz, Cocteau, Dali, Hitler, Stalin, all were offspring of the carnage. The war was the fulcrum of modernity. For a century, Europe had been at peace, even as industrial processes created military power and industrial capacity unlike anything seen in the history of the world. And as the boundaries of colonial ambitions expanded and then tightened like a noose around the neck of civilization, a single bullet into the neck of a prince in Sarajevo sparked the greatest cataclysm in the history of the world. Churchill famously called it the 30 Years' War. He said that never was there a war less necessary to fight than the First World War, or more essential to win than the Second. And the Great War was indeed the fulcrum of modernity, and it's against the backdrop of that history that this story this morning begins. Its genesis was rather innocent. In the spring of 1996, I traveled 4,000 miles across China and Tibet from Chengdu in western China to Lhasa and Kathmandu. And that was a fateful spring when the debacle happened on Everest that John Krakauer wrote about so powerfully. And I was traveling with Daniel Taylor, whose father and grandfather had been medical missionaries. His grandfather was a great friend of Howard Somerville, George Mallory's closest friend on Everest. And Daniel had been nursed on stories of Everest in the 20s, and the commercial scene of today was not of his imaginings. And he was so distraught over the unnecessary loss of life. And the very next year, we found ourselves at the base of the east face of Everest, the legendary Kanchung face, standing on ground higher than any in Europe, as we looked up at 2 vertical miles of ice rising to the south col of Everest from the east. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to speak of these Englishmen dressed in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow as they attempted to find the chink in the armor of Everest in 1921. And as a great Anglophile and a Canadian, I was immediately enchanted. Now, the basic story is well known to you. England, an empire of explorers, had lost the race to the North and South Pole, and so Everest kind of emerged as a third pole, hovering as it did over the heights of the Raj, and it became a kind of a symbol of British aspirations. In 1921, they set out just to find the mountain. They returned in 22 and 24 to attempt to scale it, and then famously on June 8, 1924, George Mallory, the most famous climber in the British Empire, with his young acolyte Sandy Irvine, were seen by Noel Dell cresting a northeast ridge, going strong for the summit when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And the story, or the question that haunted British mountaineering, of course, did Mallory get to the top before he met his end? I was never interested in that story. What interested me is the spirit that carried him aloft. I had this sense that, having gone through the Great War, these men would have seen so much of death that it had no hold on them, nothing more to teach them. And they lived as the purpose in life, in fact, was to keep focused on where you were. And my sense was that on that day, they might have accepted a level of risk that would have been unimaginable before the war, the very risk that Everest demanded. What mattered was how one lived. So I set out to find out where each of the 26 men who went to Everest in those 3 expeditions had been on every single day of the Great War. Now that may seem like an impossible task. It was famously said of both the Battle of Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead. But if that was the case, they took record of everything else. The British front was remarkably small. It never measured more than 125 miles long. For much of the war, it was 85 miles long. Behind that front, the British would build 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad. In the salient around the medieval cloth town of Ypres, area 4 miles by 12, 1.7 million boys would fall. And not only was the area so small, but there was a tsunami of literature and regimental records that poured out poetry, prose, chronicles, from the haunted voices of a young subaltern to the bombastic boasts of a Yorkshire sergeant. This tsunami, cathartic tsunami that flowed out in the late 1920s. So there was no place on that battlefield that hadn't been documented at every moment in the war in multiple voices. And that journey through that world that took me to 57 archives was itself what Siegfried Sassoon said, a journey through the slow twilight of hell. At the outbreak of the war, a man had to stand 5'8" to enlist. By November of 1914, men 5'3" were eagerly recruited. Cremation was unknown before the war in Britain. After the war, it became the preferred form of burial for countless thousands who had lived 4 years and 4 months in the presence of rotting flesh. Plastic surgery was born of the war, and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of young boys who would spend the rest of their lives behind wooden masks, attending special holiday camps where they could remove the mask and feel the wind on their gargoyle features without fear of humiliation or shame. The regular army in the British Empire required 2,500 shovels. On the front, 10 million were required. 25,000 Welsh coal miners spelt the entire war underground, ferreting beneath the German lines, exploding TNT with percussive power that was felt beneath the feet of women strolling on Hampstead Heath in London. The sound and the stench. In the Napoleonic Wars at Waterloo, 20,000 cannon were fired in a day. On the Western Front, both sides would sometimes exchange 1 million shells. Bayonets accounted for just 1/3 of 1% of the mortality. 35% of the men were cut down by machine gun fire or rifle fire, but fully 65% died just clinging in terror to the mud wall of a trench as a storm of fire and thunder fell from the sky. Each month, the British Army required 10,000 junior officers just to replace the litany of the dead. By the end of the war, 1 million dead in the British Empire alone, 2.5 million wounded, 40,000 amputees, 60,000 men without sight, 65,000 men who never recovered from the mental ravages of shell shock. Women described the war through the metaphor of dance. Diana Manners famously quipped that by the end of 1916, every boy I had ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain simply said there was no one left to dance with. Stephen Spender, the poet, said the British middle class continued to dance, unaware that the dance floor had fell out beneath them. So if the quest for Mount Everest began as a grand imperial gesture, redemption for an empire of explorers that had lost the race to the poles, it ended as a mission of regeneration for a country and a people bled white by war. Of the 26 men who went to Everest, 6 escaped the war, too young, too old, other occupations, but 20 saw the worst of it. Jack Hazard, wounded at the Somme, climbed to the height of the North Pole in 1924 with open wounds, still bleeding, saturating the tunic of his climbing suit. 6 had themselves been severely wounded, 2 nearly killed by disease. 4 surgeons had dealt each day with the agonies of the dying. All had endured the slaughter, the coughing of the guns, the bones and barbed wire, the white faces of the dead. In Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who was at Ypres on April 22, 1915, when the Germans attacked using poison gas for the first time and only the heroic defense of the 1st Canadian Division held the Allied line, he wrote that night in his journal of the gas, "This horror was too monstrous to believe at first, but when it came, as far as we had traveled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth, lying on the floor and out on the fields, made me rage with an anger which no later cruelty of men, not even the degradation of our kind in the hideous concentration camps in later Germany ever quite rekindled. For then, then we still thought all men were human. Well, Young was the mentor of Mallory. On the very day that Mallory disappeared on Everest, there was another climb in the British Empire to the height of the Great Gable in the Lake District to reveal a plaque of the boys of the Rock-and-Fell Climbing Club who had perished at the front. Arthur Wakefield organized that. As a Union Jack, drenched in rain, was pulled back, he began to speak of the breath of the Moors that had led them to the spirit of self-sacrifice for king and country. And then he began to howl. Great cries of grief that echoed across the Lake District, and then he stopped. And never again would he express human emotion. Never would his children, despite the fact that he'd been a medical missionary in Newfoundland, ever see the inside of a church. So what had happened? I knew that Wakefield had been with the Grenville mission. He had sailed forth with the first 500. In fact, he had armed with his own personal money the first 500 of the legendary Newfoundland Regiment. They got to Salisbury Plain. The regiment peeled off to fight in Gallipoli. He went to the Western Front as a surgeon. Now, my grandfather was a surgeon on the Western Front, and the pressure on these men is unbelievable. Wounded, a battalion of 1,600 men had 12 stretcher bearers. If you got wounded, you crawled back to your trench, what remained of it, and then you were carried by your mates back to the casualty clearing stations where you went through a process of triage. If you were certain to die, a red cross was marked on your forehead. If there was any chance that you could reach the hospital trains to carry you to the French coast back to London, you were immediately evacuated. The surgeons, 8 to a station, 2 to a shift of 6 hours, focused on those who would die without immediate intervention. The pressure on them was simply enormous. Wakefield, I was able to discover, was at the Somme front when the regiment of boys from Newfoundland that he had literally brought into the world as one of 2 surgeons, pediatricians on the whole coast of Newfoundland, he was there by chance when they attacked on the fateful day of July 1st, 1916, the greatest debacle in the history of British arms. After the battle had started, he paced through the great assemblies of wounded to try to find the lilt of the Newfoundland accent, to see the blue puttees that they only used. It was like the entire regiment, his beloved boys, had simply evaporated. And the problem is, they had. 911 boys went over the top, 28 survived. The British High Command said it had been a magnificent display of disciplined valor that only failed of success because dead men can advance no more. Arthur Somerville was also a surgeon at the Somme. He never came back from Everest. He became a medical missionary, dedicating his life to saving the living that he might sweep away that memory of the Somme when he had walked out, having anticipated 1,000 casualties, and found himself with one other surgeon surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys. So in the wake of the war, as Tom Longstaff laconically reported, the supply of young climbers was not what it once was. Geoffrey Winthrop Young had been the kind of maitre d' at this assembly at Pennypass in Wales, where this entire generation of scholars and poets and climbers came together before the war to celebrate the potential and the new dream of a new century. Of the climbers whose honed and beautiful faces turn up in the book of memories at Pennypass, no fewer than 23 boys would die, and 11 returned so severely wounded that, like Winthrop Young himself, who lost his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front, would have to learn again how to walk. Now, the effort for Everest was never extracted from the imperial policies of the British in the Raj. The Great Trigonomical Survey had actually revealed the height of Everest in 1856, and the wizardry of differential calculus and mathematics had allowed them to compute the height of this mountain that reached beyond the horizon into Tibet, only 28 feet off from what it really was. But what interested the British was not the mountain, but what lay beyond it. This was in the height of the great game. The Russians and the British are competing for power in Asia. Rumor came that the Russians were in Lhasa, unacceptable to the British in Darjeeling. In 1903, young husband is sent in to invade. He destroys the Tibetan army, awakens the wrath of China, and then in the wake of that, the Dalai Lama, the 13th, flees to Darjeeling into the arms of Charles Bell. You couldn't go to Everest through Nepal. It was closed. Permission to go through Tibet in 1921 went through the 13th Dalai Lama, but it did so as part of a complex diplomatic initiative, which was essentially an arms deal upon which a new army in Tibet would be rekindled. In 1913, this man, John Noel, had slipped into Tibet in disguise. He had come close to Everest, but then the war intervened. He went to his death claiming that he had served actively at the front. His own daughter didn't know until I sadly told her that he had been twice hospitalized with shell shock, spent most of the war in an asylum. And in the immediate wake of the war, who then would go to Everest? Well, obviously George Mallory, the greatest climber of rock in Britain, but the other candidate for sure was George Finch, this Australian who was a master of ice and snow. And then the first scandal in Everest. 2 weeks before they're scheduled to go, the passage has been booked on the P&O. They kick Finch off the team. Both Mallory and Finch have gone through a medical exam with the Harley Street doctors. He is deemed to be unfit. Very strange, because 2 weeks later he went up to Cambridge and the oxygen deprivation tanks set world records for human endurance. That summer he climbed any number of new ascents in the Alps. So what happened? Was he kicked off because he was an Australian? Unlikely. But no one had really looked at the medical records, which just said, this man looks like hell. He's exhausted, he's wasted, he hasn't been eating, he's totally unfit. Well, it turns out events in his private life had taken a tumbled turn that would have left any man exhausted on the fateful day of that medical examination. And the saga begins innocently enough at an officer's dance in 1915 when he met young Betty Fisher, an actress, 22 years old, dangerously pretty. They eloped, leaving their return address as nomad's land, and then he had to ship off to war. She was going to sit out the war in his memory in a house in Dover. He went off to fight eventually in Salonika, and then word reached him in early 1916 that Betty was in fact dying back in London. He got compassionate leave, came back to London, found out that Betty was not only not dying, thank you very much, she had just given birth to a baby boy that was definitely not of his blood, who would become the actor Peter Finch. George did the proper thing. He went off to France, found the cuckold, thrashed him to the point of death, nearly got court-martialed, and with her having begged his forgiveness, he set off to war again. Then word reached him that her fidelity was somewhat tangential. And he didn't really mind, because by this point he had fallen into love with a nurse, Gladys May, on the Salonika front. So right after the war, he returns to London, gets his divorce from Betty, and then immediately marries Gladys May, as a gentleman would, who by that point was pregnant with a child that was of his blood, but there was a problem. He no longer loved Gladys. He was in love with Agnes Bubbles Johnson. So 5 weeks, he married Gladys because she was pregnant with his baby, and then his divorce came through, and then she went to court. And a judge ordered him back into the bed of the wife that was about to give birth to his child. He then did what any honorable man would do at the time. He arranged, as I discovered, to do very private adultery on March 15th in room 477 of the Strand Hotel with 4 prostitutes. This left Gladys with no choice between dishonor and granting him his freedom. But as it turns out that on the night of the medical exam, old George Finch had a few things on his mind. 2 weeks previously, he had been ordered to return to the bed of a woman he disdained who was about to give birth to a child. Out of that disastrous relationship, he had inherited responsibility for a 4-year-old boy that bore his name, but not of his blood, Peter Finch. To rid himself of the second wife, he had promised to give her 100 quid a year at a time he had no income, and on the very day of the medical exam, he was scheduled to commit adultery in the Strand Hotel. So it's no wonder, as I wrote in the book, that he had lost his appetite, and the doctors reported his complexion was sallow, his general appearance tired, his condition poor. So who did go to Everest? Well, they looked like a rather wimpy lot, but let me tell you how wimpy they were. The man on the left, Sandy Wollaston, responded to an advertisement in the London Times to look for to go to the Mountains of the Moon in Uganda, where he joined this botanical expedition after 9 months of travel, another 9 months in the jungle, and then when it came time to go back to Britain, he said, why go back the same way? He walked from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second since Stanley to do it. Second, from the right, Howard Burry, who led the expedition in 21. He once stripped himself naked and anointed with holy oils, walked the length of the Ganga, eventually killing a man-eating tiger that had killed 7 holy men. He was at the Somme as well, commanded to dig a communication trench to a place called Devil's Wood, where that afternoon 4,000 British boys had died. In the darkness, with the very lights, the cannonade, he began to shovel, and to his horror, he discovered he wasn't shoveling through the chalk soils of Picardy, but 6 feet deep of corpses from previous battles. And so in 1921, they follow Young Husband's route up through the Chumbi Valley, and then they take a left at Ferry Zong, walking 400 miles off the map just to come to close quarters with a mountain that no European had embraced, from the leech-infested jungles of Sikkim to the great Tibetan plateau in the shadow of Kampazong. And here a strange thing happened. Alexander Kellis, 56 years old, too old for Everest, died of essentially exhaustion. On the day of his burial, this man, Oliver Wheeler, Canadian surveyor, seconded to the expedition from the Survey of India, given the task of mapping the inner massif of the mountain. He would spend more time on the mountain, higher on the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain than any other one of that expedition. On the day that Kellis is buried, his journal reads, "Well, they buried the old boy in the morning. Terribly sorry to have missed it. Thought it'd be the afternoon, but I do hate funerals." Well, I knew, how do you miss the burial of one of the 6 men you're walking across Tibet? The answer would be on the Western Front. He was a soldier. By October of 1914, the British Expeditionary Force was annihilated. The British line was held by the Canadians in the north, the Indians in the south. The topography of Armageddon was in place. The Germans were sapping our lines, and it came to the attention of his command that the Germans had saps within 10 feet of their frontage. He was given the order to go over the top with 120 soldiers, bury those saps, and do so in a way that the Germans would never try that again. He goes over the top, all hell breaks loose. The saps are full of Germans about to attack him. Horrific hand-to-hand combat. The Indians eventually push the Germans back, but not before the trench is lined 3 bodies deep, chest to chest, as he would write, of dying boys flailing about like trout in my kraal. That's why he discovered a disdain for funerals. Now, the challenge was to find the mountain. They knew of an ancient monastery, and here you see the motley assembly in 1921. They knew that they could come up from the north. Now, the key thing here is these were ridge walkers. Crampons, front-pointed crampons did not exist. The ropes were trivial. They had to find a saddle, what they call a col, that would lead to a ridge that would lead to a ridge. So as they reconnoitered the entire mountain, they came upon the Rongbuk Monastery, the legendary north face of Everest, and Mallory and Bullock found a col to the left of this frame that they could not approach from this side. The whole quest in 21 was to get to the North Col from the east, however that might be. That was the key, even as Zatro Rinpoche watched them. Eventually they move over to the east of the mountain, camping at Petanringbo, and then they finally make their way up to Windy Gap, where finally George Mallory looks out over the head of the East Rongbuk to the east side of what he called the Col of Our Desires. Now, this is interesting. Not once, but twice that day, he lies to his wife, Ruth, back in London, saying if we only knew where this glacier ran to, we'd know the key to the mountain. But he did, because our man Oliver Wheeler, a surveyor of incredible perspicacity, had already found that route and mapped it. Mallory lied to his wife and to history. To this day, he is credited with finding the route to the mountain. It was done, in fact, by Oliver Wheeler, a Canadian. Mallory hated Canadians. I don't know how you hate a Canadian. I'm a Canadian. But here's a beautiful thing. As they came down to cross that, to climb that col, to reach higher than any human being had reached in history, who is the one man old George Mallory decides to take with him? Oliver Wheeler. They crest the height of the North Col. They're met by a wind so ferocious it's like nothing that's ever been felt. Mallory and Wheeler said the only way they survived asphyxiation was to remember what it had been like at Passchendaele, at the Somme, as they breathed between the concussive power of the shells, the hurling wind. And they got as high as anyone had ever been. They still had a long way to go. They had to turn back. And at that point, they camped at the base of the North Col, and old George Mallory stayed up all night, saving the life of Oliver Wheeler, whose feet were frozen as he rubbed them throughout the night with whale oil. So 1922 should be a straight shot to the North Col and a simple climb up the northeast ridge. Well, 1922, at had a new cast to some extent. This man, John Morris, escaped the war by joining the Army of India. 4 weeks before he joined the team in Darjeeling, his command was ambushed on the northwest frontier, annihilated by the tribal attackers, and he wrote that night that as he sat wounded, he was watching the shadows lengthen, physically numbed, unable to move. As dusk falling, I saw a solitary figure moving slowly with difficulty. He came near. I recognized him as one of my men, my command. He was stark naked. He had been knifed in the belly, his testicles slashed. They hung by bleeding sinews at his knees. This is the world these men came out of. He meets this man, the mad mountain maniac, Charles Bruce, in Darjeeling, who pounds into his room, spitting out expletives in fluent Nepali, and the fact that Morris could answer as aggressively endeared him to the general. This was a man who, as casual exercise, would carry his adjutant up and down the Khyber Pass on his back. This is a man whose favorite party trick was to rip a pack of cards in half. He was so ferociously strong, and even at Gallipoli, when his legs were nearly sliced from beneath him by machine gun fire, he was told by his doctors as he convalesced back in Britain that no matter what he was to do, he was not to climb any stairs or to climb any hills, but no one said anything about Everest. So they returned in 1922, the strongest party yet. Finch is back with them, finally, and this is really the story of oxygen. Was it sporting? Those back in London who had never climbed anything higher than a desk thought it was unsporting. Those who were on the expedition, scientists like Finch and doctors like Somerville, felt that oxygen was no more unreasonable than a proper pair of boots. And so they moved to the the North Col. They approach it, they make one ascent, and they make a critical mistake. They don't yet know that there are no second chances on Everest. Mallory, Somerville, Moorshead, and Colonel Norton ascend together. They have a disastrous climb. Their lives are saved by Mallory with a self-arrest. They all come down broken in body and spirit. But this leaves Finch, who had been ill for a time, with no one to climb with. But what does he do? He recruits to his colors Geoffrey Bruce, the transport officer who's never been on ice or a mountain before. Wearing down jackets that he invented for the climb, they reached higher and further and closer to the mountain than anyone had done. This infuriated Mallory, who only a week before had set a world height record, now broken by his nemesis, Finch. He insists, against all wisdom, on a final assault in 1922, and an hour after this photograph was taken, the 7 last men in that line were swept away to their deaths by a landslide on the North Col. 1924, still have Mallory, by this point the most famous man in the British Empire. Finch is no longer there, but we have Colonel Norton, extraordinary man in his stead, and the Superman, Sandy Irvine, 21 years old, out of Cambridge, a Cambridge Blue, a man of ferocious strength, probably we now know profoundly dyslexic, but a mechanical savant. As a 13-year-old boy, he sent a design to the British military for a rotating gyroscope that would allow a machine gun to be fired through a propeller. He was that kind of character. And 1924, the entire weight of the British Empire was upon the expedition. Noel Dell, who had lost a brother in the war. And the inclusion of Sandy in 1924, given the tragic destiny that awaited him, has always provoked a certain amount of controversy. The critique was that he had never been on a mountain. Not really true. He had been with Odell in Spitsbergen. He had been in the Lake District. He was ferociously strong. There was also a prurient notion that Mallory had designs on the young man. When I got this book contract, it was the biggest book advance in the history of mountaineering. The British tabloids tripled it and asked the obvious question: why is a Canadian anthropologist getting this money for a book about our national icon? And the rumors went around Britain that I had somehow proven that in a 1923 book tour in Toronto, Mallory had had a homosexual affair. Well, all you had to do is go to the British Library, and the only question is what man in Britain hadn't tried to bed George Mallory. He was the most desirable man in a strange kind of post-Edwardian era when licentiousness was celebrated. John Maynard Keynes, the father of economics, was known at Cambridge as the iron copulating machine. And there weren't many women at Cambridge at the time. But this idea that Mallory somehow coveted young Irvine is absolutely ridiculous. By the time of 1924, Mallory was a very happily married man with 3 children. And of course, as I was able to determine, Sandy Irvine was wildly heterosexual. In fact, I couldn't find any mother of any of his mates at Oxford who hadn't been bedded by Sandy. But there was this whole kind of fluorescence of male love that was really quite beautiful and was part of the sadness of the war, in fact. But the truth is, if these older men so revered young Sandy, it was because, in some sense, he embodied what they had been fighting for. He was too young for the war, born in 1902, but he was not untouched by it. His cousin Edward had been killed in France. His brother Hugh was wounded with mustard gas and would have to clean every day open, weeping wounds for the rest of his life until he died in 1965. Odell and Norton had both lost brothers at the front. Somerville had struggled through those acres of dying boys at the Somme. All of them had borne witness to the carnage. And if they were all powerfully drawn to young Sandy, it was because in some small way he embodied in his vitality, innocence, and limitless possibilities the reason they had all fought and the future for which so many of their friends had died. So in 1924, Noel Odell, patron of Sandy, great climber, here's Sandy with the oxygen apparatus. His inclusion in the team also was essential because of his facility, his mechanical gifts to deal with this cumbersome oxygen apparatus to which they were by this point completely committed. From the Pangla Pass that many of you may have passed yourself if you visited the north face of Everest, they stared onto the mountain. But then they encountered something beyond their imaginings. We now know that there was this very rare low-pressure system that year in the spring of 1924 across not just the Himalaya, but the Hindu Kush that created unprecedented amounts of snowfall. This is what they didn't understand. At this point, they thought they could simply dance to the top of the North Col. They knew it so well, but instead it took them a month just to establish this preliminary camp. And even there, they kept getting beaten back by the snow. They would have to retreat to the Rongbuk Monastery to seek the support and the blessings of Zator Rinpoche, Nangwen Tenzo Norbu, so that the Sherpas would continue to go. Eventually, they get up to the North Col on a rope crafted on the spot by Sandy Irvine, and then they have a go at the mountain. This photograph taken of Colonel Norton by Howard Somerville as they approach 28,000 feet and the couloir that now bears Norton's name. That day, Norton got into the couloir. He had foolishly taken off his protective eye gear for the snow. He began to get dizzy with snow blindness, and Somerville led him by the hand out of the couloir, back down across the yellow band. Norton goes on ahead. Somerville seems to be lagging behind. Norton thinks he's just painting a watercolor, because that's what Somerville would do. In fact, what has happened, the entire frozen lining of his throat has come off, and he's done a helmet maneuver on himself to cough up the entire lining of his throat and lungs like a woman giving birth to a placenta. And dripping with blood, he simply continues down the mountain. That's the kind of men these men were. And then, of course, this fateful photograph, the day that Sandy and George left for the top. They reached, we know, the base of the first step. We don't know what happened then. And when it was very clear that they were gone, Colonel Norton wrote, as they abandoned the Rongbuk Glacier, "We were a sad little party. From the first we accepted the loss of our comrades in that rational spirit that all our generation had learnt in the Great War. But the tragedy was very near, as so constantly in the war, so here in our mimic campaign, death had taken his toll from the best. And as they retreated down the Rongbuk Valley, camping out for the last night, one of the men looked out of his tent flap and he wrote this: "I could see the whole of the historic ground, the scene of the protracted adventure, spread out like a map and bathed in soft, full moonlight. That night, and with that scene in front of one, it was quite easy to realize that the price of life is death, and that so long as the payment is made promptly, it matters little to the individual when the payment is made. Somewhere up there in that vast wilderness of ice and rock were two still forms. Yesterday, with all the vigor and will of perfect manhood, they were playing a great game, their life's desire. Today it is over, and they had gone," and here's the key line, "without their ever knowing the beginnings of decay. Could any man desire a better end?" Well, the question becomes, did Mallory get to the top or not? Most likely the answer is no. Why? The Northeast Ridge has two barriers. The first step, which can be turned, the second step, which is a formidable pitch of rock with exposures on both sides to the Kanchung Glacier, to the Rongbuk Glacier of 13,000 feet. It's a very steep pitch of rock. They didn't have crampons. Their ropes were short and weak. They couldn't have down-belayed that with the ropes that they had. We know that both of them were suffering. They had lost their stove. They couldn't melt snow. They were profoundly dehydrated. Sandy's face was just red with sunburn. Mallory left his torch in his tent and suggesting at least a possibility they climb by daylight. Today, modern climbers on that route leave at 2 in the morning, are still back at 9 the following night. So all standard mountaineering logic suggests that Mallory got to the base of the first step where one of their oxygen bottles were found and then retreated across the yellow band and had a terrible fall. We found Mallory's body, of course, still with the rope wrapped around it. Sandy Irvine's corpse has never been discovered. But there is one delicious possibility worth considering. Had the snow that pounded the North Col that season accumulated on the Northeast Ridge, as it indeed did in September of 1986, it's not inconceivable that a ramp of snow could have been formed that would have eliminated the hazard of the second step, allowing the climbers to march up at the very speed that Noel Dell, spying the climbing party from 2,000 feet below, had so famously reported. And I can promise you this, that if Mallory and Irvine had been able to walk up that snow, traversing that barrier, nothing would have held them back. Mallory would have walked on even to his end, because for him, as for all of his generation, death was but, as a boy wrote back from the front to his father, a frail barrier, Father, that men here cross, gallant and smiling, every day. These men had seen so much of death at the Western Front that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And as we think of these men coming on now to just after the centenary of the armistice, it's important for us to remember just what kind of men these were. They were men of decency, honor, discretion, and decorum, so confident in their masculinity that they could speak of love between men without shame, collect butterflies in the dawn for the British Museum, paint watercolors mid-morning, and discuss Keats, Shelley, and Shakespeare over lunch, even as they would prepare themselves to assault the flanks of Everest, or indeed the German line, by dusk. They were a kind of man we will never know again. Yet the most amazing thing to recall is that these men were our grandfathers. Thanks very much. You know, this is very funny. I'm Irish citizen. That means I never shut up. I'm also a Colombian citizen, which really means I never shut up. And that is muted a little bit by Canadian citizenship, and I'm as brass as the American citizenship I hold. I have never finished a talk early in my life. I was just so worried about this 45-minute thing. Normally that's an hour talk, so we actually have time for some questions if you want. Let me tell you one, before I jump to questions, so many beautiful things happened in this. This book took 12 years to write. And what happened is I got that book contract, and then 3 months later they found Mallory's body. And there were going to be 12 quickie books out by fall. And I offered to give Knopf all the money back, and a wonderful old, the late Ash Green, said, I didn't give you all that money for a book on Mallory. I gave you that money because I want a book by you on Mallory. And I flippantly said it's going to take 10 years. But it did. It took 12, because it forced me to go deeper into the story. But it was terrifying, because what more was there to be said, right? Well, it turns out, as Truman Capote said of Kerouac, there's writing, there's typing. I would say there's research and there's Xeroxing. And all these other 12 books were just Xerox versions of earlier accounts. It turned out there'd be everything to learn, but I didn't know that yet. But here was my breakthrough. I was at the White Museum in Banff. The Wheeler family was a big Canadian family, founder of the Alpine Club of Canada and so on. And the archivist, if you don't know the White Museum, it's the Museum of the Canadian Rockies. It's absolutely wonderful. And this archivist, just said to me, I think Oliver Wheeler's son, John, is still alive in Vancouver. I made a beeline to Vancouver and found Oliver Wheeler's son living 3 doors from the house I was born in. And he was exactly like my father. He went to the same boarding school, the same British tweeds. I mean, they were like cut from the same cloth, right? And Vancouver was a very small place in the 1920s. And so we have this wonderful conversation. Now, according to all British historians, only one journal is kept in 1921 by Mallory's climbing partner, Guy Bullock. It's a curt thing published by the Alpine Club in 1962, not very helpful. In the middle of this interview, Mr. Wheeler leans to his shelf and pulls out 2 fat journals written by his father as he walked across Tibet with Everest. I was breathless. I was too polite and Canadian to ask how to borrow them. I just didn't know what to do. And then as I left the house, Mr. Wheeler said, son, I think these will really help you. And I had those journals for 12 years. The family never once asked what became of them. And they were absolutely revelatory, right? And so as a way to thank Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler, I put together a 90-minute feature documentary on the Wheelers where I took Oliver's great-grandson and granddaughter back to India, Tibet, the Western Front, everywhere their great-grandfather had gone. And that's a wonderful 90-minute documentary feature that will be aired in Canada on the CBC. I'm actually in a campaign. This little thing here is called the Order of Canada. It's our greatest civilian award. And we've never had anyone posthumously get it. And I've got a great campaign to get Oliver Wheeler awarded that recognition. Sir, you had a question at the back. I'm sorry? I really can't hear you. Sorry, sir. Louder? Sorry, maybe stand up might be easier. Yes, yeah. One of the sad things is that George Mallory's brother was the British head of the, what was his formal title? He was basically head of the Air Force, and he crashed in Switzerland in World War II. Yes, sir. How challenging is it to go to Everest Base Camp? Not very difficult at all if you're fit. It's like everything else, you respond to altitude in an idiosyncratic way. One strong individual one day may succumb and another day may not. But as long as you pace yourself, stay hydrated and so on. One of the things that I didn't mention is that Lama of Rongbuk, Zatra Rinpoche, after the Chinese took over Tibet, that entire monastery fled to Nepal. His acolyte was Trosig Rinpoche, and I spent many months in that monastery because to be in that monastery was to know the monastery at Rongbuk in 1921. And I also went back with a man called Dorji Latu, head of the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, who had trained all the Himalayan climbers. And I deliberately didn't want to climb Everest because I didn't want any temptation to put myself in the narrative. But Dorje, for a month and a half, took me up peaks all around the area, taking me to the very edge of death so I would know what it felt like to be these men. So we've got 15 seconds. I just want to say thank you very, very much.